Hello, everyone. Welcome to this History Tea Time chat. Welcome, everyone, to this History Tea Time chat, which I'm putting on especially. It isn't my normal time, but I am not at my best at the moment after surgery. But anyway, I am motivated to go through this new evidence which has come out to support the idea that, in fact, the princes in the tower didn't escape, were actually allowed out to freedom by their uncle Richard III. Therefore, they weren't murdered. They certainly weren't murdered by him, and they lived in order to actually invade later on to try and take their place as rightful kings of England. So let's go into the evidence. First, thank you so much for joining me. I'm streaming live on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. I have just done a little Instagram to explain my bandage, so I won't go into that too much. But yeah, so we're here to talk about the Prince in the Tower. So let's do that. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I can see lots of people joining from all over the world. It's such a pleasure to be with you here today. So the weekend was actually I was almost upstaged. Maybe I was upstaged by another Philippa L. Philippa Langley with her documentary on Channel 5, Channel 4, excuse me, about the Princes in the Tower, the new evidence. But I was actually doing with Catherine, the historical collaborator. We were actually doing the Tudors Online History Festival, which I know many of you joined us for. Thank you so much for that. Our next one is on sale already, actually. It's the Stuarts Return, because we did the Stuarts as our original Online History Festival, which would have been last autumn. And it was so popular and people were so interested in the Stuarts that we are continuing with the Stuarts next spring. Ali loved the festival. Thank you so much. Laurie was there as well. Yeah, if you missed it, well, if you had a ticket and you missed the talks, remember you have got access to them until the end of January. You can also buy the talks as a pack, as an addition to the next Stuarts Online History Festival ticket, and also I will be packaging them up, and I will give you more details about how you can get hold of them if you didn't have a ticket and you wanted to get hold of those talks, including the speaker Q&A. So all the historians who were involved did a Q&A with us. Everyone's internet worked. Everyone got there. It was fabulous. So you can find out which of the Tudors, all of them, loathed the most. So you can find out who Tracy Borman loathes the most if you want, if you haven't already seen that. So that's also included. I love this. This is definitely going to be a topic today. This is a topic which, well, clearly energizes people. Clearly has energized me enough to get out of my sick bed to talk about it. So I hope you appreciate my my efforts. I hope you my analysis is useful to you. Maybe gets you thinking. Yeah, so it's definitely an interesting topic. So before we move on, I just want to say a shout out, because obviously well, not obviously, but you can support me with badges on Instagram, stars on Facebook, super chats on YouTube, but also but the way I love you to support me the most is my Patreon, patreon.com/British history, because it's £5 a month and I can give you so much more back. And I want to give a shout out to Kim, Michelle, Tina, Danielle, and Christina, because they have all become patrons in the last couple of weeks. Joe, thank you. She's just pointed out on Instagram that this show goes live in the US tonight. So maybe you can hear what I have to say and then watch it and see what you think. Or you might want to watch this after you've watched it. So this documentary came out on Saturday night here in the UK about the Princes in the Tower with this new evidence. And so the story we've received from history is well, it depends on who you are actually as to how you would summarize this, but let me give it a go. That Edward IV dies suddenly or unexpectedly in 1483. And it's April, isn't it? 1483. And it's unexpected. He's not that old. I think he's just turned 40 or something like that, hasn't he? And he leaves actually an heir and a spare, the 12-year-old Edward, who becomes Edward V, and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, who's 9 years old. The Prince of Wales, as was Edward V, as he is once his father dies, is at Ludlow Castle, where he has been since 1473. At the age of 3, he was moved there as as Prince of Wales. As head of the Council of the Marches, which is a title and position given to the heir to the throne, who is also the Prince of Wales, once invested. Apologies if I ignore comments. I'm not trying to ignore comments. It's just when I try and read them, I lose my train of thought. So let me try and keep with this. So you have the princes. So you have Edward up in Ludlow, and then Richard is with his mother Elizabeth Woodville. When Edward dies, Edward IV dies. Edward V, who's up at Ludlow, now Edward V, needs to come down to London to take up his new position as king, and obviously for his coronation. And he's with his I think he's with his Woodville uncles, isn't he, up in Ludlow, and he's coming down. Richard intercepts them. He's actually named as their protector, and so he wants to take as Edward's protector, should I say? So he wants to take charge from now on, escort the boy to the Tower of London for safety, in readiness for his coronation. Elizabeth Woodville, meanwhile, has gone into sanctuary in Westminster Abbey with all the rest of her children, and is persuaded heavily persuaded, don't know how much choice she's really being given, that Richard needs to go to the Tower as well, to be with his brother. And then the King's Council, or the Parliament as is at that time, is presented with evidence that actually Edward IV was already pre-contracted to a lady called Eleanor Butler before his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville. And this means that his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville is invalid, and therefore the children from that marriage are illegitimate. At this point, you already have a son, the Earl of Warwick, who's also a child. He is the son of the late George, Duke of Clarence. But because Duke of Clarence was executed for treason, his children are barred from inheritance, and therefore he is not a candidate for the throne, and therefore Richard becomes the legitimate, most senior candidate for the throne. And so you have Richard III. The boys are still in the Tower of London, as they have been since they are there to prepare for Edward V's coronation, which of course now is cancelled, or has been cancelled from June, at the time that Parliament have given this information. All arrangements for the coronation are stopped, and this is when they look for alternatives. Didn't have to look very far. Obviously, Richard therefore becomes king, and he is crowned. The boys remain in the Tower. Very soon, they're not seen anymore. So they've been seen playing, they've been seeing around the Tower, and then people just see them less and less and less. And there is where the understanding of events then diverges. So it's been long assumed that Richard III has had the boys killed, as he's actually usurped Edward V's throne, and therefore needs them out of the way so that he can take power. And we've discussed this at length on History After Dark. Actually, there's actually, I think, possibly good reason for him to want to do that. That is, again, without being too dismissive of its time and that kind of thing. With him, with there being boy kings, it's the end of, or it could potentially was feeling like the end of a period of very bloody civil war, and a child king, a 12-year-old, so a good many years off majority, is not a situation that anyone who's fought for that stability would be relishing. Now, so it's been long assumed that Richard actually has the children put to death, because they disappear. There's no account of where they've gone. He doesn't mention where they've gone, which is odd. But equally, there's no mass said for their souls if they'd died. There's no bodies shown. There's no funerals, and so people have wanted to know. Well, it's a mystery. It's a mystery, and therefore people come down on different sides. So there's been in the past over a decade. I actually don't know when the Richard III Society began, but the Richard III Society has been was set up and wanted to find more evidence. What actually is the evidence for how things were going in Richard's reign, for a start. What kind of king was he? And one of the major elements, of course, in questioning what happened in Richard's reign is what happened to the princes in the Tower. And so therefore here we get a divergence. You get people who the sort of received history, if you like, is that Richard killed them, and then the alternative history coming out now is, well, what if he didn't actually? What if they either escaped or they were allowed to leave? They were maybe prisoners but moved, and then actually the so-called pretenders, which came back to try and invade and take the throne from Henry VII, Perkin Warbeck, and later on Lambert Simnel. Is that the right way around? Yeah. That they were actually Edward V and then his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York. So the story that Philippa Langley now says is the story we can accept is as follows. So the boys are separated at the Tower of London on or before the 11th of August, 1483. The younger Prince Richard is sent abroad with retainers sent by Richard to look after him. And then the elder boy, Edward, is moved around the country. There is a Silesian envoy, Nicholas van Poplo, fabulous name, who records that the sons of the princes were being kept as princes at Pontefract Castle, and that he'd visited Richard there in May 1484. So they've been taken from the Tower in mid or before mid-August 1483 and actually moved to Pontefract Castle, where they were being looked after. And then when Henry VII beats Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in August 1485, the boys have to be moved abroad for their safety. And Richard, I think, goes to Ireland, and Edward is supposed to go to the Isle of, the Jersey Isles, the island of Jersey, so Channel Islands. I'll get there in the end. It's actually quite a confused story. So let's have a look at how this has been. This conclusion has been come to, and so Philippa is very clear in how she interprets this. This means that the boys were moved out of the Tower. They didn't escape. They were actually moved by Richard, and were allowed to live and lived long enough and had enough support to come back and try and claim the throne from Henry VII at later dates. So what I'm talking about here is what I've watched in the documentary, which some of you who are not who might be seeing tonight, if it's released in your region tonight, and the Go Medieval podcast hosted by Matt Lewis, who is also the chairman of the Richard III Society, and him discussing this with Philippa Langley. So they set up this what Philippa calls her evidence-based project. And it's based very much on the back of the success that Philippa Langley had with finding Richard III in infamously now in the car park of some council buildings in Leicester, which was actually the site of the abbey in which he'd been buried, and they found him, which was incredible, and has led to the Richard III Centre being created there, and Richard's reburial in the cathedral at Leicester, which is literally a few steps away from it. And Philippa talks about the catalyst for this project. It's called the Missing Princes Project. And the catalyst for her was the same week that, the week that Richard was reburied, she saw an article in the Daily Mail, and the headline was something around that it's mad to make a child killer a national hero. And this is what made her think we need a actual investigation into whether or not he actually killed the princes or not. And that everything, and when she's talking to Matt in the I think in the documentary, but also Matt in the podcast, she's very adamant that this is evidence-based project. She says it a lot. But she also does, so in her own words, literally, this is her words, literally, leaving Leicester, leaving the reburial of Richard III, I was thinking I needed a new research project. And I want you to bear that in mind as we go forward on this. The research, so the way they set it up, they set up a project and asked for volunteers. They call them members, sometimes they call them researchers, but these are people who put themselves forward to have a look through their local archives, wherever they were in the world. I mean, this is a brilliant idea, because archives, if any of you have ever been fortunate enough to go and have a look around any archives, you will know that they are, every individual archive, whether it's in a cathedral or it's a county archive or it's a city archive or it's even private houses have their own archives, or, someone like Hever Castle has its own archives. There is no way that we know, not even just what is in there, but what the content of what is in there is, if that isn't too contrived a sentence to make sense of. So it's actually, on the face of it, a great idea, because you have this army of people who can go and into archives that just wouldn't get looked at otherwise. And they were asked to send everything and anything they found relating to the years 1483, 1484, 1485, 1486, and to send everything they found, whether it implicated or exonerated Richard, anything they found should go into the project. She was very clear about that. And the project was based on cold case methodology, apparently. Now, I do want to caveat that, because they don't ever really go into what cold case methodology is, other than it should be a blank slate. You shouldn't go in with any hindsight. Now, that's actually an audit. That's not a cold case investigation. Cold case investigations, from my research into what that means, is when they're opened up when new evidence comes about. Generally, in the case of serial murders and serial rapists, they are the two main types of case where cold case methodology is applied, and it's because there will be new evidence. So obviously DNA evidence or circumstantial evidence or whatever it is. But that is why cold case investigations are reopened. Yeah. So I don't think this is exactly that, because this is looking for an answer to a question, quite specific. So, but she was adamant, send everything to her. She got over 300 members, and they each sent in a total, from all of them, of around 300,000 documents, which she had to have a supercomputer built for, apparently, in order to not only store them but be able to cross-reference them. I have to say there is not a lot of mentioning, in fact, any that I can think of examples in either the documentary or the podcast of them cross-referencing anything. Now that's not to say it's not being done, but they haven't mentioned that in either the documentary or the podcast where they've cross-referenced things, and that comes into that becomes relevant a little later on. And she does say that that the Richard Society is all about research. Like I said earlier, it's set up to research, to understand the period around Richard and his short reign in greater details. But I think we can't ignore the fact that the common perception of the Richard III Society by anyone who's not in it is that they are very much there to rehabilitate Richard's reputation. And that does cause issues of objectivity when it is Richard III Society members who are involved in this project. Philippa, though, does say, I asked for everything. I asked for everything. On the Missing Princess Project website, it does say we want this project is to help move our knowledge forward and to attempt to finally come to a definitive conclusion. Generally, that's not the way historical research goes. You're not looking for an answer. You're just looking, and the stories come out. So if you hear, like, for instance, Joanne Paul was talking about her book, The House of Dudley, with me a few months ago. Obviously, she set out to write a book about the House of Dudley, but the evidence she found, the stories she found, she didn't know were there. And so that's generally the way that these things are done, not you look for an answer. Again, the project claims to be questioning, not repeating history. That echoes to me of other books that we've had around recently, which claim that there's been some sort of overall conspiracy through the ages and across all other historians, that there's a certain story and everyone seems to be involved in making sure that that keeps going. So I don't think there's any conspiracy, but that seems to be how it's being said. Because I'm wondering if there are any other Tudor truths that are being questioned in quite such a way. So you've got 300,000 documents, which sounds absolutely incredible. I'm sure there's just amazing things in that. I don't think they certainly didn't mention any peer review. So this does seem to have all been done within, other than bringing in, bless him, but Rob Rinder, who's a celebrity judge, and other historians, just to look at particular pieces that they asked them to look at. I don't know how many independent people are involved in actually looking at the evidence that the part of these 300,000 documents. But Philippa's looking at, she's looking right down into just the mundane, what seems mundane, but actually does give a lot of information, accountancy records and things like that. That is quite often how historians piece together something like a progress. Or Simon Thurley has used, we've discussed Simon Thurley's book in the past, House of Power, in my book club. That's how he'll put together how a particular palace is built and used, and the layout of it and how it was decorated from boring accountancy records. Who's paid for what at what time and what have they paid for. So she's looking at right down into that sort of detail, or her and her her members are of this project. So that suggests a level of detail here, um, which in the documentary seems unlikely because she hadn't actually seen, well, unless it's just for TV, but it came across in the documentary that she hadn't actually seen these documents. And of course, she has to rely, of course, on someone interpreting them for her. Some of them are not only just in a foreign language, but obviously the foreign language of 600 years ago. And she does also mention that the research is ongoing. So that's very promising. So we seem to have two camps. The camp that says there just isn't any evidence that Richard III killed the boys and therefore he didn't. And the camp that says, well, no, there's no evidence that Richard III killed the boys, but we still think he did. So, anyway, so let's keep going. In the podcast, so listen to Go Medieval podcast with Matt Lewis if you haven't already, with Philippa Langley, because they go through all of this. Now they claim that the evidence for Richard III murdering it could be that they just died on his watch. Cat Marchant puts across this theory that actually plague was in London at the time. It could have been a matter of neglect, as opposed to murder. But it doesn't mean they survived. So anyway, there's another thing to add into the mix potentially. But I'm not sure what evidence they need to what they're looking for, which would say in the other way that he did murder them. It seems like if there's no actual, I don't know what they need as evidence that he did kill them before they would even remotely think that that's the case. So for instance, the Dominic Mancini dispatches, he's a monk, he's actually staying in the Tower of London apparently at the time, according to another podcast that I was listening to, called A Short History, which is very good, very, very good. Listen to that one as well. He's staying there. He notices after a few during his stay that he sees the boys less and less, and then doesn't see them at all. And he writes to his archbishop and actually says, people are starting. Well, Richard seems to have got rid of his nephews. Now, what Philippa does say, which intrigued me a lot, is that she'd built up a timeline with these documents, an actual timeline of where the boys were at what point. I'd love to see that in a more complete narrative, because that sounds fascinating. That, again, though, is not actually what has been presented, but we will go into what has been presented. And I understand there's time constraints in terms of documentaries and podcasts. Well, except for me, because I'm going to go on as long as I want to today. So I think it's a bit unfortunate that we don't get that timeline. That would have been really nice to see something really clear if she's got it, and that's what she's claiming to have. So what have we got? So we've got one of the I'm going to get into the actual documentary evidence that they cite. But one of the things they do say as fact, and this links back to what I've just been saying about Mancini, is they say that the first mention of the idea that the boys might have been murdered comes with Henry Tudor, who would be Henry VII, comes with his troops when they come over ready for the Battle of Bosworth, as is going to be, and that with the victory of Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth, then this narrative around Richard murdering the boys or having them murdered, that's when that gains traction. Now, I wouldn't dispute that Henry Tudor making out Richard, who he's usurped, out to be a bad king, bad human being, morally inferior, reprehensible person, doesn't play right into Henry's hands. Of course it does. Of course it does. Um, and but what this does do is completely ignore the fact that there were rumours going on in late 1483, through 1484, that the boys have certainly gone missing, and that Richard must have something to do with it. Maybe he's murdered them, but he's certainly got rid of them. And he himself gives no explanation. So Mancini's account is just not really, it's mentioned in the documentary, but it's not adequately dismissed, in my opinion, as to why it's not taken more seriously. It certainly means that the idea that it's never mentioned before August 1485 is just not true. That is not true. Now, Philippa points out that when Henry wins at the Battle of Bosworth, he doesn't come straight down to London, and that is because he's looking for the princes before he comes to London. I don't know what the evidence is supposed to be for that. Would Henry have any idea where the princes were supposed to be, that they would be in the Midlands somewhere? It seems a very big jump to me with no evidence cited that, he stayed up in around the Midlands because he's looking for the boys, and therefore he knows the boys are alive, therefore Richard III didn't kill the boys. That's a lot of jumping with I don't know, they didn't cite anything for saying why that would have been the case. Okay, shall we get into the actual documents that were presented? They're exciting. They're exciting because they are of the time. That has been checked. But let's go into it. So the first one is proof of life, they've said, of Edward V still being alive in 1487. And this is in the Lille archive. And it's a receipt. It's an accounting receipt. We said about getting into the accounts, what is being paid for, by whom, when. This is a receipt for 400 pikes, which King Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, has ordered to collect. I love the idea of this, like a receipt. I'm going to come and collect like a catalogue receipt or something. For some reason, Philippa says that pikes are for elite troops. Your cavalry, your elite troops. So I'm not sure where she's going with that. But that they're being paid for on behalf of the Dowager Duchess Margaret of Burgundy. Now, Margaret of Burgundy is the sister of Edward IV and Richard III. She's also, therefore, the aunt of the princes in the Tower. And so the idea that here is they are arming a force to invade England to push the claim of Edward V. Therefore, he's still alive. They believe he's still alive, and they want to invade and put him on the throne, and obviously topple Henry VII. The wording of it is very detailed. So, to take and lead across the sea with a specialist German mercenary who Madame the Dowager, so that's Margaret of Burgundy, the sister of the kings and aunt of the prince in the Tower, so who Madame the Dowager sent at that time together with several captains of war from England to serve her nephew, son of King Edward, late her brother, who was expelled from his dominion. So they've taken this as evidence that it shows a number of things. This is in December 1487. This date, this receipt is dated. And that this shows that Edward V survived the Battle of Stoke, which was in June 1487. That is when we're told that is Lambert Simnel, who comes, and he's the pretender, and that actually he's captured by Henry VII, and he works in the kitchens in the royal household. So and that this is definitely yeah, done in the name of the king, not his cousin Edward, Earl of Warwick, because in this receipt it has on a number of occasions it talks about Edward the king, so it can't be um, apparently mixed up with Edward, Earl of Warwick, who's the one who was the son of Duke of Clarence, who's yeah. So all right, keep it up. They're all called Edward. Um, now my question with this one, my concern that it hasn't been explained is why is there such a level of detail in a receipt? So Maximilian has ordered 400 pikes, and we are led to believe that on the receipt for those pikes, it details exactly who they are for and why. That seems an unnecessary level of detail. Now, if that's the same on every receipt for weaponry at this time in this place, okay. But I would need more context to really believe that somebody who's ordering pikes puts every detail as to how those pikes are going to be used on the receipt. Um, um, it also throws up an interesting idea that where was Margaret? And I don't know. Maybe one of you know. I've only had so much time to look into all the different questions that this new evidence throws up. But what was Margaret's standpoint when Richard comes to the throne? Does she accept that the boys are illegitimate? Does that just change when Richard dies because illegitimate or not, they're her nephews? That interests me as well. And they go into why is this stuff not in the English archives? You know, why have a lot of this? So that was in the Lille archive, and I think all of the the documentary evidence they found is in on the continent. Well, there's it's known that Henry VII has a lot of documentation destroyed at Richard's castles, at the Archbishop of Canterbury's palace at Lambeth. Apparently, there are hardly any records of Richard's reign. There's a fire in the Jersey archives. Jersey, obviously, being the place that Philippa Langley thinks Edward was taken to at some point. And also some records in Ireland because the Irish were supporting these claimants. That means there's a lot missing. There's a lot missing, and I struggle to believe or to understand why so much would be destroyed to cover up for one thing. So what would Henry VII's motivation be to cover up the continued existence of the princes in the Tower? That sounds like a lot of records to destroy for that. It's a very big assumption as well. So I also am not convinced that it proves that everyone who said they believed that they were fighting for Edward V actually believes he was Edward V. And I will go into why. I mean, I've got a spurious theory just to put forward a little later on, which is really purely just to say there could be other ideas here. The other thing to say about when something's missing is it's missing. You can't say what it is. It's not there. So you can't say, oh, Henry VII got rid of all those records because he was trying to cover up for the continued existence of the princes in the Tower. It's not there. It's not there, so you don't know. You can't say that. Elizabeth Norton in the documentary also mentions Margaret of Burgundy, not a fan of Henry Tudor, as you can imagine. And she says Margaret of Burgundy, absolutely would put someone else on the throne. If she could put someone else on the throne, she would. Does it matter who then at that point? And I will come back to that because one of the arguments is that they wouldn't have put all this money, resources, reputation, all this behind somebody who was they knew to be uh, a puppet. So not really. Right. The second piece of evidence was that this first person narrative of Richard, Duke of York, in the Gelderland, in Gelderland. I mean, Philippa was like, this is mind blowing. A running theme through these documents is, or the interpretation of these documents, is they have been taken on face value. That's definitely how it comes across. Um, that so there's this narrative that Richard, Duke of York, supposedly has written, which details, like a diary, like a story, what happened to him from the moment he got out of sanctuary into the Tower of London. He was kept in the menagerie, then he was picked up and taken elsewhere. The menagerie, where it's cited, he would have been seen. If you watch the documentary, they mention how the Tower of London is like a village, like a small town. There are thousands of people there. The menagerie is not a the menagerie is not a hidden place. So seems a bit odd that he's taken there, no one sees him, and he's taken safely away from there later on. So this supposed diary of Richard, Duke of York, tells us all how, fills us all in with all the details of what happened to him, when apparently. Now the document itself is of the correct period, apparently. The paper, the way it's written. No one, well, other than taking it as face value that Richard, Duke of York wrote it, but there's no, like, how do we know that it's not just somebody wrote it? This is a mystery. This is already of interest to people. It kind of read to me like someone writing a story. And they brought in Yanina Ramirez, who's a fabulous historian based at Oxford, and she did say that one seems a bit too good to be true. But they checked it. Now, so Philippa from the outset has said this is an objective investigation. However, at this point, admits her own admission that she was too close to looking to be she was too close for her to do the checks on this supposed diary entry. I call it a diary entry, sorry, a first-person narrative from Richard, Duke of York, explaining everything that happened to him, that she was too close to do these extra checks. I mean, that's admitting right there a lack of objectivity. So they did bring in two experts, someone who was an expert in Middle Dutch, which was how it was written. So he would have written via a scribe. Presumably he didn't, maybe he spoke Middle Dutch, and a expert from the Bodleian Library as well, who said it's semi-legal document in terms of how it's worded, and the watermark shows it's fully authenticated. Well, the watermark would have shown that the paper was made in a certain place at a certain time. So this is what helps to date the paper. But why it was created, who it was created by, that is missing from the explanation. The next thing is another document which has the signature and seal, apparently, of Richard. So by this point, it appears that Edward has either died at the Battle of Stokefield, or I'll come back to this, or is living elsewhere. Because if you remember a couple of weeks ago, I did a live about the church in Coalfield. So I was watching this documentary to get some of the questions answered, which I'd posed a few weeks ago, wondering if something was going to be in there. And the church wasn't mentioned once in the documentary, by the way. She does mention it in the podcast with Matt, so I will go into that in a moment. So we have another document dated 1493. By this point, it's Richard who is heading up, supposedly Richard who's heading up this, his title for title for position of King of England. He's now calling himself Richard of England, and there's this royal seal on this document. The document is actually a pledge of 30,000 florins to Albert of Saxony for his support in recognising Richard as the King of England, and that will be paid to Albert within 3 months of Richard securing the throne in England. Almost like a no-win, no-fee arrangement. Now, again, here, it's signed Richard of England. There's no mention as to why they know that that is a genuine signature. Where's this is what I'm saying, the cross-referencing, I didn't hear any evidence of cross-referencing. Where is the how do they know that that's Richard of York's signature? He's 9 years old when he goes into the Tower of London. What documents has he got his signature on by that point? A seal, yes, is a way of authenticating documents at this period. That doesn't mean that someone can't create a new seal. So where's that evidence that that's an actual seal, that proves, because this is what they're saying, that actually proves that he is Richard, Duke of York, and by this point, heir to, supposedly rightful heir, or actually rightful king, if his brother's already died, of England. So now, when I was watching the documentary, and people who are watching it tonight, you can look out for this, and maybe I've got this wrong, but I think they said that that he was calling himself heir to his father, Edward IV. He's not heir to Edward IV. He's heir to his brother, Edward V. So that wasn't explained either. And the last document that they describe, that they found and that they featured, is a description of a meeting between Richard, Duke of York, and Maximilian. So Maximilian is, if you remember, he's the man who's ordering the pikes for for who he thinks apparently is Edward V, and now he's continuing to put his money and his time behind who we're led to believe is Richard, Duke of York. He describes his meeting with Richard, Duke of York, and he says this is definitely him because he has 3 birthmarks. There's 3 marks that are unique to him, and everyone who knows him will recognise him by these marks: his eye, his mouth, and a mark on his thigh. And that's enough for Maximilian, to say that yes, his this is Richard. So there's a few things there. Has he ever met Richard before? That wasn't mentioned. There's sort of this assumption, oh, they're family, so they will know each other. They don't know each other. It's like, this is not. Well, I don't know if Maximilian was, but close enough. But but certainly Margaret of Burgundy doesn't necessarily have ever. Well, she leaves the country before Richard is born. And I couldn't find reference to her ever coming back to England or the baby Richard going over to the continent. So why? I just don't think this can be taken at face value, that there's birthmarks and they're only known to people who already know them. They haven't necessarily seen them before. If they had met before, why was that not cited in the documentary or the podcast? Yeah, it's not enough just to say they're family, so they knew each other, so they knew these birthmarks. The one on the thigh as well is rather questionable. Really, what did they do? Get his thigh out when he was a small child to show everybody, so that just in case something happened in the future and he needed to be identified, they could get his thigh out and show it? Okay, that doesn't sound very likely, does it? So, but what's in it for Maximilian? Why would Maximilian be, because one of the pieces of evidence is, well, Maximilian and Margaret of Burgundy aren't going to be supporting someone who isn't king, or yeah, well, There's not really much of an explanation here other than Maximilian is supposedly close to Margaret of Burgundy. Don't think that's really enough of a reason to spend a lot of money and a lot of troops. And also he was a Yorkist. I find that interesting, slightly odd, that that someone who is ruling on the continent is somehow partisan to what's happening in England. But he didn't like Henry VII. Henry VII wasn't giving him the kind of trade deals he wanted. So that makes sense. Well, I'm going to back this person because once he's on the throne, he's going to owe me, and we're going to have a much more favourable trade agreement for me and for my country and for my people. That makes sense. But now we're getting back as well to, so Philippa just says when Edward V dies at Stoke Field, Maximilian doesn't get the money that he's promised for backing Edward V because Edward V died, so he's not come on the throne. And so again, that was a leap. That was a sudden statement that hasn't got any evidence behind it that has been presented. And so Matt did question Philippa on that, and she said, "Oh, well, that is one of these other lines of investigation that they're going into to look at the Coleridge Church." So the Coleridge Church, the one that I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, that evidence was presented or published around about this time last year, and maybe a bit nearer to Christmas, that Edward V actually has a tomb at this church in Coleridge in Somerset. So if you want to look at my analysis of that, it wasn't just my analysis, by the way. This is based on David Starkey's work and other people's work. So it's not mine, but I covered that a couple of weeks ago. And the idea there being that, well, if he didn't die at Stoke Field, that maybe he was badly injured and therefore he went and lived out his life in Somerset. Okay. No real explanation as to why that would be allowed. So he takes to the battlefield against Henry VII, is badly injured, and then spends the rest of his life living as a war veteran, effectively in Somerset, which is not. It's well within the country. So, and actually, well, I went into the whole. Was it a tomb of someone called Evans or? Anyway, I went into that one in the last live. Now, here in the podcast, Matt mentions, and this I think is very interesting, that Maximilian, had extracted from Richard a promise that if Richard died without heirs, Maximilian's family would become heirs to the English throne. They take this as evidence that they were going to be on Richard's, or the Yorkist side, if you like, as opposed to the Tudor side, and therefore back the princes. I think there's another way of looking at that. I think that shows a ambition to take the crown of England, and that to do that in the name of one of the princes, to exterminate the Tudor threat, to exterminate Henry VII and the Tudor regime, and then identify the person who you've said is Edward, or later on Richard, as somebody who's been a fraud. You then replace them with yourself or your heir. So I think that's not evidence necessarily at all that Maximilian is somehow supporting the boys, or that he believes that they are the true people. Now, when I was doing my last live, I did. Well, we are with 55 minutes. Thank you ever so much, everyone, for for staying with me through this. But yeah, so when I was doing my live, I did pose some questions that I said I hope that the documentary would answer. And one of them was, if Edward V is buried in Somerset, what happened to his brother? Well, this project does claim to have pieced together where Richard, Duke of York, was. Like I say before, the timeline that Philippa says she has, I would like to see. That would be great. I mean, that would be incredibly interesting if we could see actually, maybe I imagine there would be gaps, but where the princes went, at what time, who was looking after them, who was paying for their food, who was paying for their clothes. If they're looking at accountancy records, then this is the sort of stuff that you would think would be in there. Another question I had was, what advantage does Richard have exiling Edward into the same country? Again, I don't feel like that was even if well, Edward seems to have been kept very close. So even if he's been taken from the Tower, that he is somehow he's been moved around the country and then into the Channel Islands. It seems very close, very close. So that doesn't make much sense to me. One of my other questions was, why keep quiet about being Edward V and then splash it all over your tomb? That question still stands. And the other one was, what advantage does Henry VII have for allowing Edward V to stay in the country, if that indeed is who is living out his days in Somerset? Again, that's not answered. It seems very dangerous to me to still be here. So, so it's interesting. I think the idea of having an army of people going out and looking at archives is very exciting. I'd like to see perhaps that employed with other things. I think you need to do it without looking for something particular. The time period idea is interesting. So we'll just, what is there for 1483 or whatever period you're looking at. I think, though, to claim that that this is an objective piece of work is it's not. It isn't. It can't be. She talks about how she's emotional and can't do the checks on one of the documents, particularly. That's just indicative of the whole thing, as far as I'm concerned. And the assessment of the documents, especially given in the documentary, which some of you will be seeing tonight, when it comes to it, if you listen to what they're saying, they've authenticated that the document is contemporary. That's it. They haven't authenticated that who it was written by. There's no mention of like, for instance, the Richard of York. Sorry, excuse me. He signs it Richard of England. There's no. Okay, tell me where else that is that he would have written that at a time where it was undisputed. His claim, his position is undisputed. How do you know that that's his signature? Because I could write a piece of paper now and say this happened, this happened, this happened, and write it, Catherine Middleton, and in 600 years' time, is someone going to pick that up and go, oh, Catherine Middleton said this happened. Future Queen of England at this point says this happened. Need to know more about how that is authenticated. I have to say as well, I did notice that the success, well, in fact, this was a direct answer by Philippa to a question that Matt posed at the end. Why should sort of people, I can't remember his exact question, excuse me, but it's sort of, why should people who are skeptical, why should they entertain this idea that we found more evidence directly contrary to this received historical narrative? And she cites finding Richard III as evidence as to why people should accept that this evidence says what they're saying it is. It's such a leap to say that because something happened in the past which has nothing to do with this, that the evidence they've presented, that the way they've interpreted that evidence is correct. It was so much of a leap. So I think it is definitely one interpretation of the evidence. I don't think that the evidence they've presented actually says what they say it says. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean that, but the leap is quite large without other supplementary evidence. Um, um, like for instance, I've given you my spurious. This is just to make you think. Maximilian already has been promised the throne if Richard III dies without heirs. Richard III actually has died without heirs because none of his nephews are legitimate. And if Maximilian puts one of these, let's call them pretenders for the sake of argument, on the throne and then can expose them as a um, as a uh, as a fraud, then he can put himself on the throne. If we're going out for all theories, why that could be one as well. So I'm still left with lots of questions. It also, I will conclude with this, and this is what happened with another famous book, which I won't name because it doesn't need any publicity. That there is somehow that anyone who isn't, right, let me see how I'm going to put this. Anyone who isn't in the camp of wanting to exonerate Richard III of the murders of the Princess in the Tower, wanting to rehabilitate his reputation beyond doubt. Anyone who is outside of that camp is assumed to be of the camp that they think Richard murdered them, absolutely, and that they can't be swayed otherwise. It assumes that we're sort of the rest of us. And by the way, I should have said at the beginning, I have no skin in this game. I am not a Ricardian. I am not a Henry VII enthusiast. History is history, and it's not I don't think it should be a fan club of particular members of history. I think as soon as you get into that, you have bias. And I just don't in this case. I'm interested to know what happened. We're talking about children here. I talked in the last video about the issue I see with the DNA excavation. If you wanted to, if they got the bones out of the urn, which is in Westminster Abbey, supposedly the Princes of the Tower, and DNA analysis of that, what I think of that. But yeah, so I have no skin in this game. I'm not, I don't have any particular outcome that I want or don't want. But because I'm not in the camp of thinking that Richard should be completely exonerated of this, it feels like you're supposed to be in that one, or you're wedded to the idea that he did kill, and that there's no sort of in between, and therefore there's some sort of conspiracy that we're all happy to accept received history in this particular topic for some reason. So I would argue that the weight given to the evidence actually demonstrates a lack of objectivity. I think too much weight has been given to this evidence in terms of the conclusions drawn. So I've probably kept you for long enough. That's an hour. I'm getting hot. The heating's come on. Let me know what you think in the comments. You might agree with me, you might disagree with me. It's fine. That's what we're here for. Enjoy the documentary if you're watching it tonight. It's out in the US tonight, I believe. And you've also got the Gone Medieval podcast with Matt Lewis that you can listen to. In a few weeks' time, we're going to be having the only dissenting voice in that documentary, Nathan Amen. Catherine, how do you pronounce his name? We're going to have Nathan on anyway on History After Dark. So we haven't got any History After Dark tonight. We've taken a couple of weeks off for various reasons. But next week we're back with Gareth Russell, and the week after, or was it 2 weeks after that? We'll let you know anyway on History After Dark. Nathan, who I like to say is the only dissenting voice in that documentary, he will be on History After Dark. So that will be a fun one, definitely. Right, everybody, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed that. Like I say, put in the comments what you think. Please give this video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed it, and I will see you all very soon. All right.